Okay, so, I think we've all been there, right? You're trying to have a conversation with a native English speaker, and it feels like they're speaking a million miles a minute. You catch a word here and there, but the whole thing just whooshes right past you.
Oh, yeah, for sure. It's incredibly common, and it can be so frustrating, especially when you know you've got a pretty good grasp of the vocabulary and grammar,
Yeah.
but then the speed and the way they connect the words just throws you off completely.
Exactly. It's like, wait, I know all these individual words, but why can't I understand what they're saying when they're all strung together? And that's what we're going to really dig into today. We're going to give you some concrete techniques, things you can start using literally today to improve your listening comprehension, especially when it comes to fast, natural English.
And I think it's helpful to start by really understanding what makes this so challenging. It's not just about the speed, it's more about the style of spoken English. Native speakers tend to blend words together, they use lots of slang and informal expressions, and then you throw in regional accents, and it can feel like you're trying to learn a whole new language on top of the English you already know.
It's like English 2.0, the speedrun edition.
Right, exactly.
But here's the good news, folks. Listening, just like any skill, is something you can train and improve. Think of it like building muscle. If you consistently use the right techniques, you will get stronger and more adept at understanding those rapid-fire conversations.
I completely agree. And the first step is to understand some of the specific things that make spoken English sound so fast and fluid. One of the key concepts here is something called connected speech. This is where native speakers in natural conversation don't pronounce each word in isolation. They blend the sounds together.
So it's kind of like when you're writing really quickly, you might start joining letters together to save time.
It's a very good analogy. It's all about efficiency, just like with handwriting. And this connecting of sounds leads to all sorts of interesting changes. For example, the phrase, "What are you doing?" often becomes, "What are you doing?" in fast speech.
Oh, yeah, that's a classic. I've definitely heard that one before.
And it happens all the time. Want to turns into wanna. Going to becomes did you. Sounds like didcha. These are incredibly common, and they can really trip people up if you're not used to hearing them.
So it's like almost like there's a secret code to how these words can kind of like, I don't know, smoosh together.
Exactly. And there are a few patterns to this smushing that you can really pay attention to. Um, One common thing is a reduction of unstressed syllables. Take the phrase, "I have to go," for instance. That second syllable, to, often gets reduced to a very quick, almost breathy "tuh" sound.
Interesting. So it's not even a full two anymore.
Nope, it's just a quick little sound that kind of blends in with the surrounding words. And this happens a lot in English, especially with vowels and unstressed syllables. They often become this very neutral, short sound called sh.
Ashwa. Huh. That sounds almost as mysterious as the connected speech itself.
Well, it's not so mysterious once you start listening for it. It's everywhere in spoken English. And it's one of the main reasons why words can sound so different in isolation compared to how they sound in natural flowing conversation.
And then on top of that, you've got slang and informal expressions, which, let's be honest, can be like a whole other language in themselves sometimes.
Yeah, slang is super context dependent, right? What might be common slang in one group or one part of a country could be totally unheard of in another. So you're not just decoding the literal meaning of the words, you're trying to figure out their implied meaning, which can be tricky.
It's like trying to solve a riddle while simultaneously trying to understand someone speaking at warp speed. No wonder it feels challenging. Okay, let's talk subtitles for a second. I think a lot of people, myself included, have gotten really used to relying on subtitles when watching movies or TV shows in English, but I've heard that it can actually hinder your listening development in the long run. Is there any truth to that?
There is some truth to that, yeah. It's not that subtitles are inherently bad. They can be very helpful for understanding unfamiliar vocabulary or for following along with complex plots. But if you're always relying on them, you're not really giving your ears a chance to do the work. Your brain is mainly processing the written text, not the spoken sounds.
So it's like you're not really building those listening muscles because you're using the subtitles as a crutch.
Exactly. It's a bit like always using a calculator and never doing mental math. You're not exercising those mental math skills. And it's the same with listening. If you always have the subtitles there, you're not really pushing yourself to decipher the sounds and extract the meaning from the spoken language alone.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think the last piece of the puzzle here, the thing that can really throw a wrench into your listening comprehension, is accents.
Oh yeah, accents can be a major hurdle. You might get really comfortable understanding one particular accent, let's say a standard American accent, and then you encounter someone from Scotland or Australia, and suddenly it feels like you're back to square one.
Right, because it's not just about different pronunciations, it's also about different rhythms and intonations, the way people rise and fall, their voices when they speak. It's like a whole other layer of complexity on top of everything else we've talked about.
Absolutely. And it can be disheartening, to feel like you're making progress and then you encounter a new accent and it feels like you're starting over. But the key here is to remember that everyone has an accent. And even within a single country, there can be huge variations.
So, okay, we've laid out the battlefield here, the things that make understanding fast native English speakers so difficult. It might sound a bit overwhelming, but the good news is we're now going to arm you with some powerful techniques to overcome these challenges. And the first one is all about starting slow and gradually increasing the speed.
This is super important. It's kind of like warming up before exercise. If you try to jump straight into understanding native speakers talking at their normal pace, it can be really overwhelming and discouraging.
So it's about setting yourself up for success by choosing materials that are at your level and gradually pushing yourself to handle faster and more complex speech over time. What kind of materials would you recommend for someone who's just starting out?
Well, there are a lot of great resources designed specifically for English language learners. Things like BBC Learning English, Voice of America. They often have audio materials where the speakers talk at a slower and clearer pace, and they use simpler vocabulary and grammar.
So those are great places to start, just to kind of train your ear and get used to the basic sounds and rhythms of the language.
Yeah, and the key is to not get stuck at that slower pace forever. Once you feel comfortable with that, start gradually pushing yourself to listen to things that are a little bit faster, a little bit more complex. Maybe try listening to podcasts or watching YouTube videos that are aimed at native speakers, but choose topics that you're already familiar with.
That's a good tip because if you already know something about the topic, you can use that knowledge to help you fill in the gaps and understand what they're saying.
Exactly. And another really useful tool here is playback speed control. A lot of podcast apps and video players have this feature where you can adjust the speed of the audio.
Oh, yeah, I use that all the time.
It's so helpful. You can start listening at, say, 75% speed, so it's a bit slower, and then as you get more comfortable, you can gradually bump it up to normal speed and maybe even a little bit beyond that.
It's like training wheels for your ears.
Yeah.
Okay, technique number 2 is the listen and repeat method. This one sounds pretty self-explanatory, but is there more to it than just, listening and repeating?
There is a bit more to it than that. The key here is to really focus your attention on the sounds, the pronunciation, the rhythm, the intonation. You're not just trying to understand the meaning, you're trying to replicate the way the speaker is actually saying the words.
So it's like I'm not just passively listening, I'm actively trying to embody the sounds and the way they're being produced.
Yeah, exactly. And there's certain types of resources that are particularly good for this. TED Talks, for example, or many YouTube channels, they often have transcripts or subtitles available.
So you can listen to a sentence, repeat it, and then check the transcript to see how accurate you were.
Exactly. And that feedback is so valuable. It helps you identify specific sounds or word combinations that you might be mishearing or mispronouncing.
Okay, so listen and repeat, really focusing on the details of the pronunciation. That's technique number 2. Technique number 3 is all about actively decoding connected speech, which we talked about earlier. How do we actually train our ears to hear those blended sounds and those reduced forms?
Well, now that you know that these things exist, you can start consciously listening for them. Pay attention to how words run together, where sounds are dropped, where vowels become really short, or change altogether.
So it's almost like once you're aware of the patterns, your brain can start to pick them out more easily.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it can be really helpful to focus on some of the most common reductions. We talked about want to becoming wanna, going to becoming gonna, did you becoming didya, but there are many others. Have to often becomes hafta, kinda becomes kinda, a lotta becomes a lotta, sort of becomes sorta.
Those are all super common. I've definitely heard all of those before.
Right. And once you start actively listening for them, you'll realize how often they pop up. And the more you hear them, the easier they become to understand.
It's like learning the secret handshake of the English language. Okay, technique number 4 is about using subtitles strategically. We talked about the downsides of over-relying on subtitles, but you mentioned that there's a way to use them that can actually benefit your listening skills. Can you explain that?
Yeah, so the key here is to use subtitles in a two-step process. The first step is to watch something with subtitles. But the goal here is not just to passively follow along. You're actively trying to understand the context, the plot, the vocabulary. You're building a foundation of understanding.
Okay, so subtitles on for the first pass, really focusing on absorbing the content. What's step two?
Step two is to watch the exact same thing again, but this time, turn the subtitles off. Now, your brain had that context from the first viewing, and it's forced to rely on its ears to make sense of what's being said.
So it's like a test, but you've already had a chance to study the material.
Exactly. And here's a little tip to make this even more effective. As you're watching without subtitles, try pausing the video at regular intervals, maybe every sentence or two, and try to recall what was just said. Really try to replay the sounds in your head and see if you can identify the key words.
So you're actively engaging your memory and forcing yourself to retrieve the information you just heard.
Exactly. And if you're really stuck, you can always quickly glance at the subtitles to check. But the key is to try to do it from memory first.
That's a really clever way to use subtitles. Okay, let's move on to technique number 5, which is all about active listening. What exactly do we mean by active listening, and how is it different from just, passively hearing things?
Well, passive hearing is just the act of sound waves entering your ears. You might be hearing things, but you're not really paying attention. Active listening, on the other hand, is a much more engaged process. It involves focusing your attention, making a conscious effort to understand not just the words themselves, but also the speaker's tone, their intent, the overall message they're trying to convey.
So it's about being present in the moment, really tuning in to what the speaker's saying and why they're saying it.
Yeah, it's about being an active participant in the communication process, not just a passive recipient of information.
And you mentioned a specific exercise that can help develop this skill of active listening. Can you describe that for us?
It's a really simple exercise, but it's surprisingly effective. Choose a short audio clip. It could be a news report, a podcast segment, anything really. And as you're listening, try to write down just 3 to 5 important content words from each sentence.
So not every single word, just the key words that carry the main meaning.
Exactly. This forces you to really focus on the core message, to filter out the less important words, and to actively process what you're hearing.
It sounds like a great way to train your brain to hone in on the most important information. Okay, we've arrived at our final technique, number 6, which you called shadowing. What is shadowing, and why is it so effective?
Shadowing is a more advanced technique, but it's super powerful. Essentially, you listen to someone speaking, and you try to repeat what they're saying at the exact same time, as closely as you can. You're mimicking their rhythm, their intonation, their pronunciation, everything.
So you're like a vocal shadow, following their every move.
Precisely. And what makes shadowing so effective is that it works on multiple levels. It improves your listening comprehension, your pronunciation, your fluency, your awareness of rhythm and intonation, all at the same time.
Wow, that's a lot of benefits packed into one technique. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground today. We've talked about why understanding fast native English speakers can be so challenging, and we've given you 6 concrete techniques to help you improve your listening skills. Now, are you ready to put those skills to the test?
I think it's time for a little challenge. I'm going to say a few short sentences, just like you might hear in everyday conversation, and you see if you can understand what I'm saying.
Okay, listeners, are you ready? Here we go.
I'm going to grab some coffee. You want anything?
All right, how did you do with that one? Let's try another one.
Hey, how's it going?
And one more.
Let me know if you need help.
So those were just a few examples of the kind of rapid, connected speech you might encounter in the real world. The key takeaway here is that the more you expose yourself to natural English, the better you'll become at understanding it. Make a conscious effort to listen to native speakers every day, even if it's just for a few minutes.
And don't be afraid to experiment with the techniques we've talked about today. See what works best for you. The most important thing is to be consistent. Just like with any skill, the more you practice, the better you'll get.
Absolutely. And remember, improving your listening skills is not just about understanding words. It's about connecting with people, with cultures, with ideas. It's about opening yourself up to a whole world of communication and experience.
And it can be such a rewarding journey. The feeling of finally being able to understand a fast-talking native speaker, to catch their jokes, to follow their stories, it's a truly amazing feeling.
And it's a feeling that's within your reach. So keep practicing, keep pushing yourself, and never give up on your goal of mastering English listening comprehension.
And as you continue on your journey, think about the specific situations in your life where being a better listener in English would be the most helpful for you. Maybe it's at work. Maybe it's when you're traveling. Maybe it's when you're watching your favorite movies. And then really focus on using the techniques we've talked about today in those specific contexts. It'll make the learning process feel more relevant, more engaging, and ultimately more rewarding.
That's a great point. It's about making the skills you're learning directly applicable to your life and your goals. Okay, folks, that's all for today's deep dive. We hope you found it helpful and inspiring. We'll see you next time.